Hi, everyone. Welcome to Time with the Bible Live. We've been going through the Gospels, looking at different elements, different times, different events of Jesus's life, different teachings and interactions with people. And we're just trying to get to know Jesus better. That's been our goal through all of this. Today, we're going to be in Mark chapter 14. So if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn there. We're going to be kind of flipping back and forth between Mark 14 and looking a little bit at John 12, John's account of this. But we'll be looking at this anointing at Bethany. I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. In Mark chapter 14, I'm just going to read a couple verses for us to get us started. This is one of those sections in Mark where he does the story within a story. There's a reason for that, and I want us to be able to see that because it's kind of a sandwich story in the sense that we have like the two buns and the meat in the middle. So I'm actually going to read the outside edges of this story first before we look at the middle part and really dig into why this is here. So Mark chapter 14, I'm going to read the first couple verses here, and then I'll go skip down to verse 10 and 11. We'll talk about that for a minute, and then we'll look in the middle section. Mark chapter 14, verse 1, it says, "After 2 days, it was the Passover and the feast of the unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how that they might take him by trickery and put him to death. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people." Skip down to verse 10. It says, "Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. So he sought how that he might conveniently betray him." And so we're looking at the time of the Passover. It was going to be just 2 days away. This would have been like Wednesday, and he's going to be crucified on Friday. And the chief of I want to kind of remind you of the context of what's going on here. Jesus has been in the temple. It's been question after question. They tried to trip him and trap him, and they tried to find ways that they could get something to stick so that the people would be willing for them to be able to put him to death. That's really been their goal throughout the whole thing. And they're just desperate. They want to put him to death, but they have a problem. And the problem is that it's during this time, there was lots of people that are coming in for the feast days. And that would have been a lot of people also from Galilee. He was extremely popular during the time, or in the region of Galilee area. Lots of his ministry, like 75% of the ministry that we have written in the Bible, occurred up there. And so he's really popular there, but he's just kind of popular all over. And they're afraid that if they were to take him and put him on trial and crucify him, that they would have a riot on their hands. They'd have this uproar going on. But they are really desperate to get rid of him. But they just kind of know from a practical standpoint, it's just not going to be wise for them to go ahead and crucify him. They know that that's not going to be very good for them. And so that's the beginning part. And then you kind of like hold that thought for a minute, because we're going to look at this. We're going to look at this event surrounding it. But they're really desperate to go ahead and kill him. And so we kind of say, where there's a will, there's a way. Well, they found a way. The only way that they would be able to do this is if they didn't do it during the day. If they were able to do it at night, and you'll see this later on in Mark and the other Gospels and how this all played out. But they found a way. And one of the ways was they could find somebody inside the inner circle of Jesus that would be able to tell them insider information so that they would be able to kill him. And so they found a willing partner in Judas. And man, if you just think about Judas for a minute, you just think about everything that Judas saw, everything that he was involved in. He was part of the 12 that was sent out in the limited commission. He was part of the 70 that was sent out to preach the gospel. He'd seen every miracle, heard every teaching. It's really challenging for me to think about this man being willing to crucify Jesus, being willing to put him to death, or be a part of all that, when he'd been so close to him and he'd seen everything that Jesus had done, heard everything, experienced it all. And that's really challenging. But Judas had an issue within himself. And actually, we're going to see that over in John. What was it that caused him to do this? Why would he do this? And I think that's why we have the sandwich story here. The middle part kind of gives us some information about what Judas was doing and where his mind was and where his heart was in all of this. In fact, let's go ahead and turn over to John. Well, I tell you what, stay here at Mark 14. You're going to mark both places, and we'll go back and forth. I'll read Mark's account, and then as we go through, I'll point out some things that's said over in John's account that I think will give us a little bit more information in all of this. So let's go ahead and read 3-9. 3-9. It says, "In beginning in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came having an alabaster flask of very costly oil, a spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. And there were some who were indignant amongst themselves and said, 'Why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.' And they criticized her sharply. Jesus said, 'Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good. But me you do not have always. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Surely I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her.'" Okay, so kind of hold the thought about Judas for a minute. We'll get back to that. I think Jesus kind of does a flashback. This story, this event is actually told in 3 different gospels. You have Matthew, Mark, and John's. There's also an anointing over in Luke's account, but Luke's account is not the same anointing. If you just compare the details of all 3 of them, you're going to see that it's not the same. It's a very different one. But I think as debated as that is, I think it's very clear. What we do know is that Matthew, Mark, and John's account are all the same anointing. This is anointing that happens in Bethany. He's in Bethany, and there's a couple of things that you can kind of conclude from looking at the other accounts. Number one, this is around Saturday. This would have been an event around Saturday at the time right before his triumphal entry. And then you also find out who this woman was. This woman was Mary, of Martha and Mary. But it goes back a few days, and I think there's a reason why Mark brings this up, though. In the middle of telling about Judas, I think there's a reason and a purpose for that. Hey, CJ, glad you're watching and participating. Appreciate it, brother. So in verse 3, Jesus is in Bethany. He's at the house of Simon the leper, probably somebody who was previously a leper, somebody Jesus healed, most likely. But he's reclining at the table, which is exactly what they would do back then. They would lean. They'd have a lower table, then they would lean. That's how they would sit. But while he's reclining at this table, Mary comes in, and she has this alabaster flask of very costly spikenard, which apparently was really, really expensive stuff. Later on in verse 5, they say that's worth 300 denarii. If you look over in Matthew's account, you'd see that a denarii would have been a day's wage. So you have 300 days worth of wages. That's a year's worth of wages almost. If you go over to the feeding of the 4,000 or feeding of the 5,000, remember Thomas had this discussion with Jesus, and Jesus says, "Well, why don't you give them something to eat?" And they said, "Well, we don't have." He said, "We don't have 300 denarii in order to feed them, or we don't have 200 denarii in order to feed them." And if he's right in his summation of 5,000 people being able to be fed by 200 denarii, 300 denarii would feed about 750 people, or excuse me, 7,500 people. And you kind of get a better understanding when you think through that. You kind of better understand why the people become indignant towards Mary as she's doing what she's doing. But this is really expensive stuff. And look at what she does in verse 3. She takes this expensive perfume, she cracks the flask, and she pours it over his head. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. If you're just wanting to get a little bit and dab on yourself, by the way, I think that's a waste. I'm not a big perfume person, but perfume in general is just kind of a waste. But she takes the flask, and I think this is intentional by Mary to use it all. Because if you wanted to preserve what you didn't use, you wouldn't break the flask because it would go bad. But instead, she breaks it, she pours it over her head, and he would have just been drenched in this perfume. I can't remember I think it's Mark's account. Maybe it's John's account that says that the fragrance of it just fills the entire room. You know, what she's doing here is really remarkable. It's not something that probably you and I would do. Maybe you wouldn't want to do something that extravagant. And in verses 4 and 5, look at what the disciples are thinking about this as they're doing it. They're angry. They're just thinking, man, what a waste. Again, I think that's kind of general thought when it comes to perfume anyways, but they're thinking we could have done so much good with this stuff. And they're thinking it, they're not really saying it. Look over in John's account, look at John 12. I'm going to read John's account. I think it gives us a little bit more of a understanding of what's going on here. In John 12 and verse 1, it says, then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of oil. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? And this he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. And he had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. And Jesus said, let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not always have. And so according to John's account, we find out who the ringleader of all of this was, Judas. And he had a particular interest in her selling this perfume and the money that she would have got out of it. In fact, John's account says he was not really thinking about the poor. Here the disciples are thinking, man, think about how many poor people we could feed with this. But Judas is more thinking about, man, I can't imagine how much of the cut of this I would be able to get if she would have sold it. He's just thinking about his pocketbook more than he is thinking about the poor. And so unless he considers himself to be poor, he has zero interest in the poor. Here he is. He's this thief. And I think this is really important. Remember the context of, remember the passage over in Mark and the beginning and the end. There's a reason why this is in the middle there. And I think that's why. I think Judas is indignant. He's angry that he didn't get a cut of it. And so maybe he's trying to make up for what he lost out on when Mary poured all this oil over the top of his head. What does Jesus say about what this woman did there in verse 6? Jesus sticks up for her. Jesus tells them to leave her alone. She's done a good work for me. Ask this, how was this a good work? Or was this a good work? You think about people in our culture, and we'll get a little bit more into this when we talk about some application of this, but when people would look at this, they might think, well, that's impractical. That's going a little overboard. That's wasteful. That's too extreme. I think that's what the world would do. While the world would never say that there's ever too much thing as too much money or too much power too much education or something like that. But when it comes to religion, I think they think, well, that's just too much. Too much dedication to the Lord. They'll always say something about it being too extreme, too much. I think that's one of the lessons that I learned in this. The Lord is pleased when the Lord is pleased when we realize that honoring God is not wasteful. I've had to figure this out in my life. When I was a kid, always went on Sunday morning, but it wasn't just Sunday morning. It was Sunday evening, and then Wednesday night went as well when the church met together. And I've had times when people look at me and think, why do you go that often? That's just a waste. When I was playing basketball, I loved basketball. But for about 3 or 4 years, my practices always fell on Wednesday night. And I was so thankful that my parents made me make it a priority in my life. And but I can remember times going back after services, I would go and get the tail end of practices. And some of the people there would say, well, why do you go to church on Wednesday night? Why aren't you here? I think as I've gotten older, I've realized it's not just about honoring God on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday night. It's about honoring God with my whole life, with everything that I am. It's never a waste to honor God in your life, and it's never too extravagant. We'll keep thinking about that as we go through here, because I think there's a big message in the contrast between Mary and Judas as well. But you think about it, when you're a young man and you like a girl or something, what does a young man do for a girl? Nancy, I'm glad you're here. Glad you're participating and watching the study. Always appreciate everybody that's joining in. But when a young man loves or has feelings for a young girl, what does he do? Well, sometimes he goes extravagant. Like, he'll pay. He'll buy flowers and take her out to a nice restaurant, and probably that's probably unwise. Well, that's what you do for somebody that you love and that you're dedicated to, and that he was really important to her. She really loved him. She wanted to give him the best that she could. And Mary is expressing this in what she's doing. And so I love verse 8. He says, she has done what she could. Jesus says, you're always going to have the poor around you, but you're not always going to have me. I wonder if Mary didn't understand something that the apostles couldn't wrap their heads around. Like, this was the end. Like, he is going to Jerusalem. He's going to enter into Jerusalem, and they're going to put him to death. And I wonder if Mary didn't grasp something that the rest of them did. I don't know what she was thinking in regards to doing this. I'm not sure everything that she had in her mind, but Jesus says, you're not always going to have me around. And Mary understood something about that. And Jesus sees this as a good work, an anointing of his body. This was something that you would do to honor those who had passed away that were honorable. And, I'm not sure she understood everything, but that's what this was, Jesus says. And notice he says she has done what she could. She's done everything she could. Are we doing that? Or do we think that that's too much in our lives? Too costly, too extreme? And I love verse 9. He says that wherever the gospel goes, this is going to be a memorial to her. Everybody's going to hear about what she's done here. And that's true. Like today, as we're going through the gospels, we are memorializing this girl, this woman who has done so much for Jesus. 2,000 years after it happened, we are still memorializing what she's doing. One more point that I want to bring out is that I think Mary understood something about standing alone when you're honoring God. She didn't care that no one else, everybody else was angry about what she was doing. Sometimes service to the Lord means we're going to be the only one standing up doing what is right. And Mary understood that, and Mary was willing to do that. Nothing else mattered. The Lord mattered to her the most. And sometimes we just got to get over that and realize that it's going to be hard. We live in a world that looks at things like that as too extravagant. But it's okay to be alone. It's okay if other people don't understand what you're doing. You're not we're not supposed to be moved by what other people think in regards to the things that we've been called to do. So I want to think about this contrast. You have Judas who is selling Jesus out. It didn't take much. The money that he received for doing it was minor, insignificant. But he was so greedy in his heart, and he cared more about money than he did about the Lord. And I'll tell you what, it's not just about money for us. It can be anything in our life. Do we care about anything else more than we care about the Lord? Then that's an idol to us. So are we more like Judas, or are we more like Mary, who's willing to sacrifice things? By the way, that perfume may have been something that was passed down to her. May have been a family heirloom. That's what I'm told as you study this and some of the things that they had back then. You just don't save up 300 denarii. What do we make? I don't know. $40,000. Was that around the average? $50,000 a year, something like that. Can you imagine $50,000 perfume? And this may have been an heirloom, and yet she's willing to sacrifice an heirloom, something that was of value to her, something that was of great value for the Lord, to be able to honor him, because she knows that honoring God is never too extravagant. But which one are we more like? And I think maybe a lot of us would say, well, I'm somewhere in the middle between the two. Well, how do we get to be more like Mary? We want to be a whole lot less like Judas, and we want to be a whole lot more like Mary. Some things to think about. I love this story. I love the way that Mark presents it because of the contrast between the two. I think it challenges our minds just a little bit more. But I hope you can kind of take that with you today and think about that a little bit more. Go back and study this on your own. Always, if you have any more questions, you can go back to the recording of this. You can rewatch it, and you can make comments, and I can always respond back to those things. But appreciate you guys being here. Glad that you're here. CJ made a comment. He says, and we are still talking about her in 2023. Application. Will my service be talked about after I'm dead? Have you left your mark? I'm willing to do something extravagant, and am I willing to do something extravagant for Jesus? That's right. Really, in the grand scheme of things, it was something so small. It may have seemed like a big deal in the moment, but I love the way that Jesus talks about service. Talks about visiting people who are sick or people who are in prison. Talks about giving a cup of cold water to those who belong to him, and how much of a big thing that is in our service to each other or in our service to the Lord. And I think you're absolutely right. What an amazing thought that God, who sees our service, even the things that we do in secret that no one else does, he's going to reward us openly. I think it's really helpful to think through. And I appreciate your comments, CJ. Thank you, brother. Hope you can take that too and give some thoughts to that. And again, you can always come back to the recording and make a comment, and I can respond back to that. And I love all the conversations that are started by lessons just like this. But I hope you all have a great day, and everybody God bless.